Hello, I'm Colin Wu, and welcome to this webinar, an update on the ADGM Company Service Providers Framework. The Company Service Providers Framework, or CSP Framework, is designed to ensure a robust regulatory regime for company service providers in ADGM that is in line with international best practices and address the challenges and risks associated with the increasing growth of special purpose vehicles, or SPVs, and foundation structures. The CSP framework has two key features. One, persons providing or intending to provide company services in or from ADGM must meet the strengthened regulatory requirements set out in the amended ADGM regulations and rules. And two, setting up and maintaining a non-exempt company, that is an SPV or a foundation, in ADGM requires the appointment of an ADGM CSP to carry out regulatory obligations on behalf of the non-exempt SPV or foundation as prescribed under the ADGM regulations and rules. Today's webinar will focus on aspects of these features. Presenting this webinar today with me are my colleagues Natella Safar Ali and Syed Shah. Please note that you are welcome to post questions at any time during the presentation. These will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Today's session agenda includes an introduction that will highlight features of the CSP framework. Natella will then go into detail on circumstances when an SPV or foundation may be exempt from requirements to appoint a CSP. Syed will cover the license application conditions that are required to be met for the new activity company service provider and what is required to be provided in support of a license application or license variation application. Natella will then outline the transition period, including when non-exempt SPVs or foundations must appoint a CSP. Finally, I will outline notification of appointment requirements. On 12 April 2021, the new CSP framework came into force. It introduces the new controlled activity of providing company services, which is found in the Commercial Licensing Regulations, Controlled Activities Rules 2021. Providing company services means any one or more of the following services: acting as an incorporation agent in connection with the incorporation or registration of ADGM body corporates, providing company service to any body incorporated or registered under the Companies Regulations 2020 or the Foundations Regulations 2017, acting as a registered office provider, providing directors, secretaries, councillors, registered agent or other officers to any body corporate in ADGM, and providing nominee shareholders of companies to any body corporate in ADGM. Under the new CSP framework, new specific conditions of license must now be met to be able to add the activity 7025, company service provider, to an ADGM license to be able to conduct this new controlled activity and be appointed by non-exempt SPVs and foundations. A new business activity of being a registered office provider has been created, aimed at those licensees who only wish to provide registered office services to ADGM body corporates. Information for CSPs can be found on a dedicated ADGM micropage on the ADGM website. Under the CSP framework, non-exempt SPVs and foundations must at all times have a CSP. There are exemptions from this requirement, and Natella will cover this in the next session. Pursuant to the regulations, a CSP that is appointed by a non-exempt SPV or foundation is obliged to maintain records of the SPV or foundation, must act as registered office provider to the SPV or foundation, and is authorized to represent the SPV or foundation in its dealings with and give all notices, filings to the registrar. Furthermore, non-exempt SPVs and foundations must make available all information and documents to the CSP in order for the CSP to comply with those obligations. It is important to note that non-exempt SPVs or foundations who do not appoint a CSP commit a contravention of the regulations and are liable to a fine not exceeding level 7, that is $25,000. Non-exempt SPVs that do not appoint a CSP may also be subject to the registrar's striking off powers under the company's regulations. Information on the CSP framework can be found on the ADGM micropage by selecting Operating in ADGM from the menu bar at the top, and then selecting Company Service Providers from the drop-down menu. I'll hand over now to Natella, who will cover the next topic in this webinar.
Thank you, Colin. In this part of the webinar, I will take you through exemption categories for companies and foundations, and I'll provide you with an overview of the particular requirements that you would be able to complete in order to seek the exemption. Just for everyone's information, the updated SPV and foundation brochures are available on a dedicated CSP webpage. Now, the detailed guidance on exemption categories is also available on the same webpage. We have placed a very useful self-assessment questionnaire on the same page, which I would strongly recommend and encourage every interested person to use. Now, let's go through each and every exemption category. Section 296A3 provides the exemption categories. Now, it states that a body corporate that is a subsidiary undertaking of any of the following need not to have an CSP. Now, very quickly on the subsidiary undertaking. The meaning of subsidiary is contained in the section 1015 of the company's regulations. It states that a company is a subsidiary of another company if that other company holds a majority of the voting rights in it, or is a member of it and has the right to appoint or remove majority of its board of directors. So we're talking about the majority shareholder here. Now, first exempt category is persons exempt under the ADGM Commercial Licensing Regulations exemption rule. So these are a body corporate which is established by any law or decree issued by His Highness, the ruler of the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, or any federal law, except for the companies in commercial law. The second exemption category is an authorized person within the meaning of ADGM Financial Services and Markets Regulations 2015. Now, this is a legal entity which currently registered in ADGM and holds financial services permit issued by ADGM Financial Services Regulatory Authority. So it's a financial firm registered in ADGM who wishes to set up an SPV. Next exemption category is persons licensed or regulated by Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates. Now, these are legal entities holding a valid license or authorization issued by UAE Central Bank. UAE Central Bank maintains a public register of such institutions on their website. Next exemption category is a company whose shares are admitted or trading on a regulated market in the United Arab Emirates, including ADGM. So this will be legal entities whose shares are admitted on DFM, ADX, Nasdaq Dubai, or any other UAE regulated markets. Now, the last exemption category is an interesting one. It states a company that has demonstrated to the satisfaction of the registrar to have adequate presence in the United Arab Emirates. Now, this is the category for which you will have to apply and make your case to Registrar of Companies in order to obtain the exemption category. Now, we would be requesting you to send these documents to ADGM email address, registration.adgm@adgm.com. Now, the documents that we would consider for the purpose of granting that exemption would be anything that would provide the evidence that the company indeed has substantial presence and substantial assets in the United Arab Emirates. Now, on these slides, I have listed the samples of documents that we would consider. This is typically that would be copies of commercial licenses of operating entities currently operating in United Arab Emirates. The licenses may be issued by Department of Economic Development or licensing authority of a free zone located in the United Arab Emirates. We would request you to include copies of the latest audited accounts of these operating entities. It would help if you could provide a list of companies' assets, physical assets, buildings, machineries, production lines, factories that are currently located in the United Arab Emirates. We would encourage that you include the information on number of employees that those companies employ and annual turnover for each company. We would also like to see the organization structure, the brief overview of the company, perhaps board of directors, the board committees, the detailed description of the resources available in the compliance and legal divisions within those operating entities. It is of particular interest for us to see whether or not there are sufficient human resources within compliance and legal division of those entities. We would like to see detailed description of each person who is employed in that entity and their previous experience, their current day-to-day duties, and their professional qualifications. Now, in addition to that, we would be also interested to see if you have any internal policies, for example, corporate governance policy, risk and compliance policy, anti-bribery and corruption policy, data protection policy, and also demonstrate to us the compliance with those policies and monitoring the compliance with those policies.
Thank you, Natala. The relevant legislation for the new company service provider activity is in Section 12 of the Commercial Licensing Regulations 2015, Conditions of Licensing and Branch Registration Rules 2021. In addition, company service providers intending to hold client money will be required to satisfy the requirements under the Commercial Licensing Regulations 2015, Client Money Rules 2021. To ease the application process, the Registration Authority developed a checklist which must be completed and submitted with the application. I will now be providing you with an overview of the requirements under Schedule 1 of the Conditions of Licensing and Branch Registration Rules, which covers the main requirements for the activity. Schedule 1 has 4 conditions. Condition 1 is related to the fit and proper requirements. This condition is split into 2 parts, the applicant and the individuals. Part 1. The applicant's fit and proper is assessed based on the business case provided and the applicant's good standing. The applicant's good standing includes, but is not limited to, late filings, outstanding fees, outstanding fines, submission of the annual AMR return, and Go AMR registration. Part 2. The individual fit and proper is assessed through the fit and proper forms which are available in the checklist. Every director, partner, and manager appointed to conduct the activity is required to complete a separate fit and proper form. For the purpose of this section, the managers are key persons appointed by the board to carry through the strategy, implement decisions, and policies of the board related to company services. In addition, individuals will be assessed based on their relevant experience and qualifications. This is covered in Condition 4. Condition 2 is related to the applicant's policies and procedures and controls. As per the rules, the applicant is required to submit a copy of risk management policy, the risk management policy, which must include operational risk and business continuity risk. The second part would be the AML policy. The AML policy must cover the requirements under the ADGM AML rules, which is rules 1 to 9 and 11 to 15 that apply to the NFPPs. Third, a record-keeping policy must be submitted along with the application. The record-keeping policy must include a record retention schedule. Fourth, a client money policy. A client money policy is required only if the applicant intends to hold client money. The policy must cover handling and segregation of client funds and assets. Fifth, internal control policy, which is a policy to monitor the effectiveness of the above policies. Lastly, a staff training plan that covers the training on the above policies. Now, Condition 3, which is related to the professional indemnity insurance, the applicant must provide a copy of a professional indemnity insurance which must be appropriate to the nature and size of the applicant's business. And the professional indemnity insurance must cover against negligence, errors, or omissions by the applicant, and any liability for the acts of the applicant's directors, officers, and employees. Lastly, Condition 4 is related to the adequacy of resources. There are 3 different parts in this condition. Part 1 of Condition 4 is related to the adequacy of human resources. The applicant must demonstrate that they have adequate human resources, and the human resources must have sufficient experience to conduct the activity. The sufficient experience will be assessed based on the CVs or biography submitted with the applications. Part 2 of Condition 4 is related to the financial resources. The applicant is required to submit a copy of the latest monthly management accounts, or the applicant may submit financial statements, at least balance sheet and profit or loss statement. Part 3 of Condition 4 is related to the system resources. This would be a description of the systems in place to ensure that the applicant has controls to discharge its obligation as a company service provider. These obligations are covered in the company's regulations and in the foundation's regulations. In addition to the conditions in Schedule 1, Section 12.4 requires company service providers intending to outsource its activities under the UAE Economic Substance Regime to comply with the outsourcing requirements under economic substance regulations. This can be found in Clause 2 of Article 6 of the ESR regulations. As mentioned earlier, the registration authority has developed a checklist which must be completed and submitted along with the firm's application. Also, if the applicant is currently licensed to conduct the previous activity 7021 corporate service provider, the applicant is required to remove this activity from its commercial license when submitting the application for the new activity 7025 company service providers. The cost of a license variation application is $100, and the estimated turnaround time is 10 working days. The purpose of this application is to provide an overview of the firm's business and to assess the firm's eligibility for the activity. Therefore, the registration authority expects all applications to be detailed. Currently, we have recently received applications and are currently being reviewed. However, I'd like to highlight the common observations that were identified during the review of the current applications. The fit and proper form should be completed for all directors, partners, and managers, as mentioned in my first slide. A separate form is required for each member. Firms missing to submit the completed checklist, which is publicly available on ADGM website. Lastly, evidence of outsourcing agreements when the ADGM entity is outsourcing any of its operations to another party. Lastly, I would like to highlight that the registration authority does not guarantee that applications received shortly before the 12th of July will be reviewed by them. Therefore, we urge you to submit your applications as soon as possible. I will now hand over to my colleagues who will take you through the rest of the presentation.
Let's look at the transition periods. There are 2 sets of transition periods, one for CSPs and one for non-exempt SPVs and foundations. Now, current corporate service providers wishing to provide company services and be appointed by non-exempt SPVs and foundations must be licensed to do so by 12th of July 2021. Now, the non-exempt SPVs and foundations can be categorized into 3 different scenarios. Scenario 1, we have non-exempt SPV and foundation or foundation incorporated or registered prior to or on the date when CSP Framework comes into force on 12th of April. These legal entities must appoint a CSP at its next commercial license renewal date or the end of 12 months from 12th of July 2021, whichever is earlier. Now, in the scenario 2, we have non-exempt SPVs and foundations incorporated or registered after 12th of April and before 12th of July. Now, these legal entities must appoint a CSP at or by no later than the first commercial license renewal date. In the scenario 3, we have non-exempt SPVs and foundations incorporated or registered after 12th of July. So these legal entities must appoint a CSP from the date of incorporation or registration. Now, I would like to give a very brief overview of the new amended SPV business plan form. We have included a preamble in that form, and that preamble contains overview of the new CSP regime. It contains brief description of exempt and non-exempt categories of applicants, and it contains a declaration. Please read that part very carefully. It's very important that you read it and you understand it before you sign that declaration. On that note, we're going to move to the next section of our webinar. Over you two.
Thank you, Natella. Notification of the appointment or cessation of appointment of a CSP is an important requirement under the CSP framework. Under the regulations, a non-exempt SPV or foundation must, within 14 days of a person becoming or ceasing to be a CSP of the SPV or foundation, give notice to the registrar of the change. A failure to comply with this requirement is a contravention and liable to a level 2 fine. Furthermore, when submitting a notification of an appointment, the CSP must also provide its written consent to be appointed. CSP appointment and cessation forms are available on the dedicated ADGM micropage and are required to be completed and submitted to the registration authority via the mailbox monitoring@adgm.com. That concludes the presentation part of this webinar. For the Q&A session, we now invite you to post any questions you may have for Natella, Saed, or myself.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. This is the Q&A part of the webinar, so we do invite people to post your questions and we'll do our very best to answer them. Certainly there are two categories. One may be those who are interested in the conditions of license to conduct CSP, and then also those who want to know more about what are the requirements for an SPV. I see the first question, we may have a copy of the presentation. Yes, a copy of the webinar will be made available after this presentation, so you can look at it again. While we're waiting for more questions, one thing perhaps is a takeaway for those wanting or wishing to conduct the new company service provider activity is that we do strongly encourage those to put their applications in well before 12 July in order for us to process the applications in a timely manner. Please note, if the applications are not complete, we will respond very quickly, but we will then send it back to you so you can complete the application. But of course, that will only delay things. So we do encourage you to go to the micro page, see the checklist, which is attached, and go through those and provide the supporting documents. Okay, one question. The first question we have is, will the appointment of a CSP be added as part of the incorporation application on the ADGM portal? Or perhaps I can start that question, and certainly Natella can jump in. Certainly for now, I understand it was going to be a manual process, but as we move to our new registry system, it's envisaged that will be captured. Natella, did you want to add anything further to that?
Yeah, thank you, Colin. That's correct. Currently, it's a paper form. It is included in the checklist for conversion for the appointment of CSP, and we intend to include it into online registry solution sometime later this year.
Thank you, Natella. Now, the next question we have here looks like perhaps this one is going to be directed to Natella. What if the client elects to file for exemption after incorporation of the SPV? Is this a possibility? Natella, can I hand this one over to you?
Thank you, Colin. So, as you know, from 12th of July, no non-exempt SPV or foundation can be registered. So if you did not file for an exemption, you cannot be incorporated. So it's really a moot question. So if you think you can be exempt, you have to file for exemption before 12th of July. Otherwise, you cannot be incorporated.
Thank you, Nutella. Thanks for that. Next question is a good one. It says law firms provide services similar to CSP services, and they want to confirm, do they need or not need to get licensed as a CSP? Now, there is a carve-out in our law, and if the law firm is advising and it's incidental part of conducting business activities of, say, legal consultancy or indeed any other consultancy, then that would not be captured. You would not be required to get the CSP application. Likewise, if you are only wanting to provide the new registered office provider activity, you will not be caught under the CSP framework because of the very limited nature of that activity. So there are two examples. But however, it is very important to remember that if you commit any of the activities that are defined as a company service provider, then you will fall under the regime. That includes acting as an incorporation agent, as I mentioned before in the webinar, or providing any other company services, providing directors, secretaries, counsellors, registered agent, etc. If you provide any of those, then you stray into the regime, and then you will be required to have that activity on your license. Next question. A CSP is liable to get their accounts audited. As you know, annual accounts are required to be filed by companies, so that will continue. There is no regime as such that if they say qualify as a small company, that they will be required to be audited. So the current regime applies in terms of lodgement of annual accounts. So depending on the size of the business, you may or may not require to get your accounts audited. As I said before, if you fall under the small companies regime, you will not be required to have audited accounts. Okay.
Colin, if you allow me to jump in here, we've received a couple
yes, please.
From current corporate service providers licensed to conduct 7021, the old activity, and they're asking if they can continue providing company services using the old activity. I just want to highlight that this activity will be phased out by the 12th of July, and companies that are not licensed to conduct the new activity 7025 will no longer be allowed to provide company services.
Yes, thank you, Saad. That's an important point in terms of why we raised 12th of July as an important date, because if you are conducting company services, which in essence and in substance is what corporate services was before, then you'll be conducting a controlled activity, and you'll need to be licensed to conduct that, and that's what's going to happen going forward. So thanks for raising that, Saad. Okay.
Colin, we have a new question here.
Yes.
The question is about new CSP license not being issued by 12th of July. What would happen to CSP's SPV setup after the 12th of July? Now, this was covered in the transition period. The current CSPs that are currently licensed for activity 7021 must be licensed for the new activity by 12th of July if they want to continue providing services to SPVs in relation to SPV setup, provision of registered office address, provision of nominee appointments. If your SPV application is currently in progress and CSP is not licensed for the new CSP activity by 12th of July, SPV application will be stalled. It cannot be incorporated on or after 12th of July as a SPV, unless a CSP which is licensed to conduct new CSP activity is appointed.
Thank you, Natella. Okay, next question is about the applicability of the client money auditor report. That only applies if, in fact, the CSP will be, in fact, holding client money. Not all CSPs will. So if you're not, well, certainly that won't apply. While we're waiting, one issue might be, can a non-exempt SPV or foundation appoint a CSP, but then appoint a different CSP to be the registered office? So the law is quite clear that the person that is appointed as the CSP must also be the registered office provider. So, for example, you can't have a CSP doing one thing and then another CSP being your registered office provider. That is not permitted.
Now, Colin, sorry, just to add to your point that the company's regulations, section 296B of the company's regulations, they set out the obligation on company service providers on what are they required to do and maintain for their non-exempt SPVs or foundations. So it is advisable that company service providers are aware of the obligations that they have on them.
Thank you, Saad, on that. Okay. The next question is about on public indemnity insurance. And the question is that it appears that some people are facing challenges. Obviously, we can't provide specific details, but in terms of feedback, we can indicate that we've received a number of applications, and we actually have seen some who have actually been successful in obtaining adequate PII cover. And we're not talking just global cover, where you have group companies have a global coverage, but also local providers. So it is possible from what we've seen. And if you in particular have a query in relation to your firm, we would strongly recommend you contact us separately to discuss that. So we'll just see if there's any more questions. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up. Before we do, we do strongly remind those who want to undertake company service providers to submit their applications ASAP. We have a very useful micro web page with all the information you need. You must submit on the registry online portal the checklist and all supporting documents that are set out in that checklist. So we strongly recommend you to submit that ASAP. That's perhaps the key takeaway and the key deadline that's coming up very soon. And certainly all SPVs or non-exempt SPVs and foundations in due course will need to appoint a CSP. I don't see any other.
Just adding to your point.
Yes.
So the estimated review time or turnaround time of reviewing a CSP application is 10 working days, and the deadline is 12th of July. So currently we're experiencing a high volume of applications, and since 12th of July is within 2 weeks, so it is highly advisable that you submit your application even before the 28th of June. That gives us 10 working days at least to review your application. Yes.
Thanks very much for that, Saad. Well, we thank everyone for taking part in this webinar and viewing it. If you have any more further questions, certainly send it through to us. Certainly, if you're a current licensee, you can send any queries to monitoring@adgm.com. Thank you very much.